edit.
They'll edit. Okay, good.
Yeah.
See what else is got.
Okay, so now we're recording.
Okay.
And it's hopefully going to work. Zoom is working. That's working. All right, so this morning I had to teach myself how to do the double mic thing, how to feed it through.
To feed it through,
Oh my
okay.
gosh, like crash course teaching yourself insane. Anyway,
well,
so
that's the way it is, unfortunately, with these jobs.
yeah. All right, so 3, 2, 1, let's start. So today my guest is my dear colleague Helen Koukoutsis. And I don't know if I pronounced that.
Oh, you did it really well.
Yes. Helen is a lecturer in literary studies in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts and a member of the Writing and Society Research Centre. Her primary research focuses, her research focus primarily is poetry, which manifests into two forms, creative and scholarly. Her core field of scholarly research is 19th century poetry, especially the works of the American poet Emily Dickinson, and her cultural milieu. Now, her creative research functions in tandem with her research on Dickinson, drawing heavily on the personal and cultural happenings of the moment in two societies, Australia and Greece. Wow. Her first collection of poems, Cicada Chimes, got to not stumble on that one, was published in 2017 by Ginindera Press. She's working on a second collection of poems that explore the experiences and stories of her migrant mother. Now, I have to say, I read your poems, both new and old, and loved it.
You did?
I was blown away. Like seriously, the one the ones that you wrote about your mother in particular gave me tears in my eyes, and I was goosebumpy. And it really moved me. And the one about your father as well.
Yes.
Am I right in presuming that's
yes.
Wow, right. So I read through, and then I wrote some new ones, some new poems. Sorry, they're your new poems.
Yeah.
Then I read the 2017 collection, and obviously the ones that you deal with religion really grabbed me, and I was very excited and thrilled, and hopefully we'll talk about that today. But I'm open to, even if you wanted to have a reading of one of your new ones,
sure,
as well. So there's
sure, I'm happy to do whatever
they were so moving, so beautiful, and why not share them? Though they don't relate directly to religion, but that's okay. So today we're talking about Emily Dickinson and her relation to religion, and obviously through her poetry, this comes out. She's got a variety of different kinds of poems, some of which are kind of, can I say, for religion, or a little bit more sympathetic to religion?
I would say yes, somewhat sympathetic,
right,
towards God.
Oh, okay.
Without the thought necessarily of institution, the religious institution,
right,
that she grew up in.
Yep.
So I do think that a great majority of those poems are preoccupied in some way or another with the question of God, and who she is in this place, this world that she's been, raised in.
Yeah.
And the revivals of the time that she grew up around, those revivals that required people to call to Christ as their savior and to be born again, and her resistance to that.
Right.
She never stood up to be counted as a Christian, which was a very important.
Yeah. So this is the conversion.
This is the conversion. Yes,
that's expected of.
She was born Christian. She was born evangelical Christian.
Right.
She was part of the Congregational church. She attended church regularly, up until her early 30s.
Right.
And writes a lot of poetry tied to the church and the church hymns. We know that most of her poetry is written in that hymnal form.
Beautiful.
So she certainly did learn a lot by attending church and by being, she says, not indoctrinated. She loathed doctrines, but she was indoctrinated in some way or another within that institution.
Right.
It can't be helped.
Because that's the other aspect of her poetry. Because so some of it is sympathetic,
Yes.
infused with religious understanding to some extent, as you're explaining. But there's other parts where other kinds of poems which are a little bit more maybe questioning,
Irreverent.
irreverent. Yeah,
Yes.
that's a good one.
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll get to them. But I
Yeah.
was just wondering, just for the benefit of, I mean, I'm sure everyone knows Emily Dickinson, but I mean,
Oh,
maybe you can give us a little just
very brief understanding of
who's Emily?
who she was.
Where is she from? Give us a little
A lovely
context.
town or village called Amherst in Massachusetts. It's about maybe 2 or 3 hours west of Boston. And I'm thinking here in terms of bus because I've only traveled with bus
Right.
on that terrain. So I remember the first time I went there, it was just a beautiful place. Very, you could see like it's cultured, but at the same time, because it's a college town. And her grandfather was, and her father was well known for having contributed and having built that college, Amherst College. She was born in 1830 and died in 1886, just shy of her, I think, 56th or 55th birthday. And, well, not just shy, it was in May that she passed away. She was born in December. And pretty much grew up in, one of the things I think that if you know Dickinson and you have read Dickinson's work, the first thing I think that you're probably told is that she was a recluse and that she maybe didn't have a sense of humor and always preoccupied herself with death and love and lots of things that kind of pop up into her work, and that she was but mostly preoccupied with death.
Right.
But that's not entirely true. And a lot of the more recent scholarship, probably in the last 10 or so years, has really dug into that a little bit, looking at her letters anew. There's a new edition that's come out, that came out last year in 2024. And just situating Dickinson in her cultural milieu and recognizing that she had a life before she closed the doors to society.
Right.
But even when she did, she still communicated with people. So she did have a sense of humor and had sometimes, is well known for having a wry sense of humor as well. But she traveled when she was younger, sometimes not of her own accord, usually for health reasons. In her early to mid 30s, she had eye problems. I think it was, I think scholars more recently have sort of been saying that it might have something to do with the fact that she might have had iritis. So she traveled to Cambridge twice for a few months, stayed with her cousins, Louise and Frances and Cross, to receive eye treatment. And then it was after that she slowly sort of, as she returned back home, she slowly sort of closed the doors to the outside world. But prior to that, you know, she was out and about. She was your regular kind of teenager, you know, cavorting with friends You know, she attended school, and I know that seems like a given, but you know, in a time where it wasn't rare, but it was difficult if you were of a female gender to be able to get a really good education. But she lived in a time where, and as well, she was from a world and from family that were middle to slightly upper class. Although her father did lose a house and then reclaim it, she came from a family of lawyers, and a very kind of industrious family as well. Um, she spent about a year and a half in a female seminary, so a boarding school. Again, because she was very vulnerable health-wise, she didn't get to finish that her education there.
Right. You did mention in a draft article that you're preparing, I hope you published this,
Yeah.
that she was prone to sickness quite a
Yes.
lot
Yeah.
growing up.
Growing up,
Yeah.
yes. And so she spent quite a bit of time at home,
Yeah.
more than likely getting educated by her mother.
Right.
And in that article that I got you to read,
Those magazines.
yeah,
Yes.
her father purchased subscriptions to magazines such as the Sabbath School Visitor, and it's largely because her uncle was the kind of, you know, editor of that magazine. So you know what it's
Yes,
like.
that's right.
It's, you know, families passing on their subscriptions and saying, you know, here, take my
Yeah.
and these journals or these magazines, like Parley's magazine and the Sabbath School Visitor, were meant to entertain. This is what her father really intended to do, and he knew that, you know, his daughter was more than often at home.
Yeah.
They were also there for educational purposes.
Of course. Because they're a particular type of magazine.
Yeah, it was that they were well, Harley's magazine was more entertaining. It was, but it also gave you a kind of geography, history, cultural base of the world and what was going on.
With a particular mission
Yes.
to tell you about the. Do you want to explain?
Yeah,
it had a religious bent.
Both of them had a religious bent.
Yeah.
The Sabbath School Visitor more so than Parley's magazine.
Right.
It had they both had a religious bent, but it was there to, in some ways, inform the young reader that, you know, whether you are kind of escaping to other worlds and other religions,
Yeah.
or other ways of thinking about the world, you should always come back home and remember that you're called to your faith. Absolutely. Is the most important thing in your faith, being evangelical, and your faith in Christ as Savior. It was the prime sort of callback, right, to your home. And it was understood that Emily Norcross Dickinson, her mother, had converted to this belief and Christ as Savior about a year before Emily Dickinson, her daughter, was born.
So from what? From Catholicism?
Well, no, they were Puritans through and through, but it was the revivals were there to remind everyone that this is your faith, this is your calling,
this is a good point to kind of clarify denominational relationships here, I guess.
Yeah.
For a lot of us who don't know much about it, including myself. So how would you classify her denomination? What is she? I think I mistakenly thought she was Calvinist.
She is.
Oh,
she is.
Okay.
But one of the arguments that have kind of surfaced from a series of different Dickinson scholars, stems from the understanding that the Calvinism that really heralded American culture, post independence from British rule, was no longer the Calvinism that Dickinson had been introduced to when she was born in the 30s and grew up in the 40s and the 50s. It had been watered down.
Oh, watered down. I was going to say what happened to it.
Well, nothing happened to it. It was
no.
it was watered down. It was, in many ways, you have to be aware also of the fact that Dickinson's worldview was changing at the time in the 40s and the 50s, because the congregational belief or the evangelical belief or the Puritan belief, let's call it it is Puritanism. It is Puritanism through and through. But one of the arguments that I was just reading before I came in by Paul J. Ferlazzo was that he starts off a chapter arguing that Cotton Mather would have burnt Emily Dickinson at the stake.
Wow.
Not because of what she did, what she does, but because of what she writes.
Writes. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Her way of thinking is so far afield from those early Puritan thinkers.
It's quite modern.
In many ways.
Reading her poetry, I'm like, what?
Yes. I mean, the fact that she oscillates between doubt and certainty.
The thinking, not necessarily the writing.
Yes, not the writing, it's the thinking.
Yeah,
it's the thinking behind her views of God and of sin and paradise, and about salvation. They would have been questionable. So she came at the right time.
Right.
A lot of Dickinson scholars make this claim that she came at the right time. She was primed for this kind of writing, really. So it's not as though she was kind of shackled by this religion in any way.
No.
And there were, at the time that she was kind of growing up, the Unitarians, Methodists, even Catholics were starting to kind of come into the community. So she was probably loosely introduced to other religions. And this is my prime sort of field at the moment, thinking about those other religions that she was introduced to through periodicals, through her immediate community, through the college itself, because the college was a missionary college. It sent out, graduates to mission in other parts of the world. And so she was privy to all of that. But we have to believe that she was not so much of a recluse she wasn't at all in her 20s and in her teens, other than the fact that she was unwell and she was sometimes at home for weeks, maybe months on end, recovering.
Do you have any sense, or would you care to kind of comment on what made her such a thinker about religion in the way that she does think about religion? What made her that? What, you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I do know what you mean.
What made her that way? I mean, not in a bad way. I mean, how did she kind of get ahead of her time? How did she kind of rise above that context? What did she read? Who did she talk to? What happened? What's your sense on this?
What did she read? Let's start with that.
Okay. Was there a crisis moment?
Yes, there was.
Oh, cool. Okay.
There was a crisis. She even says
lucky.
she writes to an editor called Thomas Wentworth Higginson in the early 60s, 1861. She approaches him, really asking him if my verse is alive, meaning she sends him a few poems and asks, is this kind of the poetry that would be publishable?
Right.
I think that's really what she's asking. Is my verse alive? Is really a statement of, powerful. Is it the kind of poetry that people would read and be moved by this poetry? And whether it's about publication or not, you can certainly see that there is this desire to reach out.
Yeah.
But in another letter to him, not that initial letter, she does confide in him that since September, she'd gone through a crisis. What that crisis is, we don't know. And there's some speculation behind it, perhaps surrounding a love interest, or it might perhaps be health reasons. It was in 64 and 65 that then she ends up in Cambridge for eye treatment. So it might be related to that. Or it might be something else that we just don't know
Right.
because,
Okay. That's interesting. The kind of mysterious element.
right,
Yeah.
the mysterious element. But going back to the point about the reading, she tells him as well
Yeah.
what she reads. She reads Keats, she
Yeah.
says. We know that she reads the Bible. She knows it and references it
Yeah.
regularly
Yeah.
in her poetry and in her letters.
Mhm.
She's an avid reader of Shakespeare.
Mm.
There's this I don't know whether it's a myth or if I'm remembering it accurately, that she would go to the she would sneak Shakespeare up to the tower of the house and read Shakespeare.
Contraband. Shakespeare, the
Shakespeare,
bad boy.
the bad boy, yes. But she read widely.
Mm.
And so widely that I can't even remember off the top of my head a
That's
lot of the works that she would have read. She read her Brontes. She read the classics as we know them now.
okay.
She was also an avid reader, and this is something that's been emerging the last 20 or so years in the Dickinson scholarship about the periodicals. They subscribe quite heavily to the Springfield newspaper, the Springfield Daily Republican. They subscribe to Harper's Magazine. They subscribe to um, uh, a series of various periodicals. And as I said earlier, the subscriptions really began with the father purchasing a lot of those early children's versions. They were heavy readers. The newspaper, we assume, even so that she says that in one of the letters, she read the newspaper, the Springfield Republican daily.
Right.
Even when one of her poems was published in that newspaper and it was done anonymously, she writes to one of her friends that she was a little bit annoyed about the way that the poem was presented, because none of those poems that she published or that were published, and there was only a few of them, were done with her permission. So there was always somebody who had one of those poems and that would kind of forward it on to a newspaper or pass it on for it to be used in an anthology, and it was never with her permission. So yeah, she did circulate her poems widely. She wrote over 200 poems that were directed to a sister-in-law. The sister-in-law lived next door to them.
Yep.
So she sent quite a few poems, not quite a few, a lot of poems to her correspondence, some of which have been lost.
Right.
We know that. We know that poems that have been lost, that have been sent to others, have gone missing because they were burned. Most often when people passed away, people didn't keep these things.
Yeah.
And so we know that a lot of what Dickinson has, remained in that, unknown territory. It's the mystery that drives us to keep coming back to her. I think
okay?
I almost pulled out the cord.
Yeah, so I think what you say in terms of the so I think clearly one of the key elements to unraveling this mystery is really related to what she was reading, and sounds like she had a broad exposure to a broad range of things.
Yes.
Sort of quite liberal minded father, it seems.
To some degree, yes.
Some degree. So he's open to at least allowing the children to read.
Yes, he
classics, Shakespeare. Not so much Shakespeare, not with his permission, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Okay. She even says in a letter that he buys me books, but he fears they joggle my mind.
Okay.
So he it seems like he wanted in many ways to educate his daughter, his children. But at the same time, he was a little bit, as a parent, a little bit guarded by what they would read. And we do know that she did conceal certain books, sometimes under the piano, and she would read them with her brother. And for fear that her father would find out what they were reading. So this is like a three-dimensional person here who's thinking like a teenager, like a young adult. But in the midst of all of that joviality, there's also that concern about not being one of the saved. And slowly but surely,
So this
her
is
father joined the church as we understand it.
Yep.
Her sister joined the church. Her brother did as well, and she was the sole.
She's the only one left with that.
Only one left.
Not confirming or
Not confirming. Yes.
Conversion is the key term they use.
Yes.
But sort of equivalent to confirming.
Confirming. That's right.
Wow. Okay. Why do you think?
You'd have to go back to the early letters, those early letters where she spends a considerable amount of time discussing with her peers, her immediate peers, her confidants like Abaya Root, Jane Humphrey, where she's trying to explain to them why she doesn't want to do this.
So I want to ask you about this. So you having looked at these more closely than I've kind of read them through your article.
You're right.
What's your sense there? Like when she's explaining herself, why I don't want, she's trying to make another human being understand and sympathize with her own. So what is the gist of that? What do you think she's saying to them? What is the reason? Is what I'm asking.
I don't know whether it varies, but there's at least on one occasion she says, I don't want to give up all.
Give up all?
Give up all. Give up this world.
So a prerequisite to her mind was giving up the world.
To some degree, yes. You're giving up the
this kind of
liberties,
Puritan, evangelical, watered down Calvinism.
Yes,
is required that you kind of give up the world.
Well, yes, you're giving up everything to
gain
Christ as your savior. And the way that she describes sometimes with friends who were either on the brink of confirming their faith or had already done so, she saw a solemnity in them.
Right.
Something serious.
Okay.
Perhaps mature.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a crossing into a maturity
that
she wasn't really ready for.
Okay.
And I think that she never really, this is where I think her humor comes from, and that we kind of lose it because we assume automatically that because she was cloistered, or that she was cloistered, she was also wayward at the same time, that she had a sense of humor. That I think the thing that really did also add to her crisis in the early 60s was the Civil War as well. She talks quite heavily about that.
Right.
You could see it in the letters that she's concerned about the deaths, the young men marching on. Yeah. She sees them in this town. It's a small town, so she will see it, even though she could see it from her room as well. But having said that, I mean, the why behind it got to the point, I think, that once you say no so many times, the bridging into saying yes and relinquishing your philosophy, your ideology,
right,
to say yes to something that is driven by an institution that you don't fully agree with.
Yeah.
It gets harder and harder.
So this is kind of, I guess, so as a religious studies scholar,
yes,
put on my professional hat here, so I sound a little bit more serious. Like I have infinite amount of curiosity about human behavior with regard to religion, and this is how I got into this mess in the first place.
Okay.
Because for me personally, it was always the question of, I mean, the biggest question I began with this whole thing when I was younger was, what is God?
Yeah.
I was too scared to say, is there a God? But I kind of asked when I was little, I was thinking to myself, what is it?
Yeah.
What is this? Amazing, most powerful entity. Or not entity, I don't even know if that's the correct, right?
Yeah.
So God, the all-powerful. So I wanted to know, right? So I guess the behavioral thing is very interesting because in my sort of my specialization, which is Sufism, there's a lot of humor in Sufism.
Mm.
Though it's solemn, it's very serious kind of things that some of these Sufi mystics and saints and desert hermits.
Yes. The desert
Technically, they're
fathers,
not
yeah.
hermits, but you know,
Yeah.
they kind of do. I'm also very familiar with Eastern Christianity, the desert fathers sayings and so on and so forth. It's very solemn, but they at the same time, in reading their sayings, can see that there's humor,
Yes.
there's humility,
Yeah.
there's infinite compassion.
Yes.
Not so much for themselves, because they put themselves through a lot of suffering,
Yes.
but for others.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of interested here in this kind of, because it tells us a lot about her understanding, not the limits of her understanding, but perhaps the limits of the institution with which she was involved. And the sort of core question I have here is this kind of always cliche institution versus personal, say this with reluctance, personal private piety.
Okay.
You know, so your own sort of feeling, because I don't know how people want to take that and qualify that, but I kind of qualify it in my own way as being you and your own God.
Yeah.
You and your God,
yeah.
you and God, and just kind of understanding that however you understand that experientially, but then you've got your institution that you know that you're raised in or whatever the case may be, and then you kind of agree or disagree with that partially, fully. You know, you have issues, but the issues are mostly with the formality, the formal structure of the thing. The rules-based system that they promote or want you to subscribe to, their version of their interpretation of the doctrine. So give all up for Christ could mean so many things, like the Desert Fathers talk about that, the Eastern Christian tradition talks about that. Sufis talk about that. Not for Christ, but I mean for God, submitting utterly to God, obviously, for the Muslim case.
Yes.
And then kind of renouncing yourself and all of that. So that I'm just, can we sort of have a, sorry if that was a bit of a,
no,
but I think you kind of know where I'm coming from on that. So what was your sense on that regarding Dickinson? Was there some kind of limitation, institution? It was institution the main problem?
The doctrine of predestination.
Wow. Okay.
If you want to sum it up, I'm sure if I kind of rack my brains right now, I could keep going with more, but she states very explicitly in one letter.
Yeah.
She doesn't, you know, the thing is about Dickinson, we kind of say that there's mystery behind it, that she conceals, that there is but she does also say, tell the truth, but tell it slant. Wow. The answers are there.
Yeah.
They're there. It was from the very beginning, the thing that was tied to a lot of that angst about confirming her faith in Christ and her faith in this institution was the doctrine of predestination, the fact that we're born sinners and that only a certain amount will kind of end up.
Well, and it's so critical how you interpret that.
Yes.
The doctrine of sin.
Yeah.
I mean, to my understanding, it's much softer in the Eastern Christian tradition than it is in Calvinism.
Yes.
I can definitely say that. I mean, it's even a little bit softer than Catholicism.
It is. No, it is. It is a little bit softer. I agree.
So I think that's critical. You're right. If you have a certain understanding that you cannot just in your soul of souls agree with, that's going to be problematic.
It is. It is. It's a stumbling block. And, you know, the female seminary that she spent about 1.5 years in, Mary Lyon, if I have the name correct, who was the head mistress.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. She insisted on making sure that the students would eventually, at the end of their education, would be confirmed. They would be converted.
Right.
It was a place of also making sure that they participated in that conversion process. It wasn't just a pedagogical space. It was also one where, and Dickinson talks about how I'm one of the few sitting down, because she would ask the students who had felt saved or they'd been saved to stand up.
Yeah.
And she would be one of the few left. At the end of the term, she says, I was the last one left.
Well,
and so that would have
resilience.
played a lot on her,
Yeah.
emotionally, I think psychologically as well.
Yeah.
You're young, you're about 17 years old. And the fear of God has been thrown out at you. And if you don't confirm, you're unsaved.
Hellfire, right? Damnation.
Damnation, yes. Yeah. And so what does she do? She tantalizes with this in her letters, talks about Satan and about snakes and reaching out to touch snakes, and she knows what she's doing.
Yeah, of course.
She absolutely does. And the fact that she does that in a correspondence with her peers, it's almost as though she's daring them.
Yeah.
And she's letting them know that I'm daring myself as well. I think it's deliberate, but at the same time, it's charged with an anxiety and a fear.
Yep. Because
she cannot undo what she has learnt and what she has been told from the pulpit.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, there's probably several reasons why she kind of withdrew from attending church.
Right.
But sermons are long and arduous, and one of her poems talks about that. It's I'd rather be in nature. Yeah, this is the world that I would have to give up.
Right, I understand that. Yeah.
To be there. And she could have easily have confirmed her faith and not still gotten married. I mean, that was still possible. It's not as though she wouldn't. But I wonder if that's kind of it's tied in many ways with living a solemn life, having children, participating in the world of marriage, and it comes as a package, I think. And I think she would have seen how her mother both struggled with it, but also and her mother was ill on several occasions. So Dickinson and her sister would have to pick up the game. She would bake the bread. Her father would eventually only eat his daughter's bread. And so she would have duties to her father. I think she already was in some sort of committed dynamic. I won't call it a relationship, but
no, I know.
She knew the responsibilities behind that. And your commitment to God is commitment to husband, is commitment to, the children, commitment to this environment that, that you have to run, this household environment. And she was running that household too. She had a system in place. We know that she would get up probably early hours of the night to write, because that's all she could really afford, because during the day you were in the kitchen, you were baking bread, you were making your gingerbread, you were cooking your black cake, and that would take so much of your time, so much time out from you, from the thing that you wish to do. So she was very active. I would believe that she was very active. Even when she was a recluse, she was active in her conservatory. Yeah. Tending to her flowers, out in the garden, tending to that space. All of that was her keeping busy, and that then fed into her poetry.
So should we have a look at some poetry?
Sure. Yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I think you've covered enough about Dickinson's context. Let's see, what's the first one you want to read?
I don't know. Which one do you want? You pick it. You pick the poem you want to start off with.
Some keep the Sabbath going to church, I think. Let's do that one.
Yeah. Now remember, Dickinson's poems don't have titles.
Right, yeah.
And we go by that first line.
Yeah, the first line I realized. Yeah. I wasn't sure.
Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchid for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplus, I just wearing my wings And instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches, a nodal clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along.
That is so beautiful. Like, it's
Yes.
really aesthetically nice to listen to.
Yes.
The way she's written it.
Yes. Yeah.
And you've read it beautifully as well. So
Oh,
thank you.
you.
So should we maybe unpack a little bit of this?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'll let you sort of kick it off.
Well, Sabbath is a day of rest. That's how I understand it.
Yeah.
But I think given that the thing that I think about when I read this poem is that given that she says that I stay at home with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome.
Yeah.
We have to imagine that the alternative here is her garden.
Yes.
And nature.
Yes.
Rather than the dome of a church.
Right.
And we have to imagine that that natural dome is top, that orchard must have trees so
beautiful,
huge that looking up kind of forces you to look up and straight to heaven.
Oh, I know, I do a lot of bushwalking, so I know exactly what that feels and looks like. And I'm always in awe when I come to a spot where you see that convergence of trees and the canopy. It is, for some reason, deeply spiritual.
Yes.
So
yes. So you can imagine what she's seeing.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
What she's seeing is she's not seeing a ceiling there.
No.
She's seeing like an open doorway.
Right.
No mediation. And I guess this is what it boils down to. I often think about this as Christ as mediator in Christian tradition. I question if in that early stage of her life, because she was interested in Christ as the human.
Yes.
Especially later in her life, as she talks about it in her letters.
Okay.
But the mediator means that you don't have that open doorway through the trees straight to eternity. Yeah, so I think that that first stanza is very telling about it also kind of it also kind of points to a far more complex understanding of Dickinson's turmoil, inner turmoils, that it isn't as straightforward as possibly staying at home and doing what you want. But we do know that she eventually just relinquished that responsibility of going to church on the Sunday. So for me, it's a moment of meditation and contemplation for her.
Right.
The Sabbath signifies this. Whereas I think when we think about that second stanza or the third stanza, God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along.
Yeah.
And that, I think, sums up what she's really trying to say about that no mediation, not even a clergyman, to mediate that experience from ground up. And through this incredible paradise that you're sitting in already.
Yep.
You know, heaven is here right now.
Yeah.
And what you make of it is really up to you. You can turn it into hell if you wish to, or you can step back for a moment, look and see that the world is beautiful. There is an opportunity to look up. What you look up to is, again, I guess, up to you. It's a kind of personal experience, I think, of
absolutely.
It is a religious experience. I think it is. Some
100%.
Yes, some keep the Sabbath going to church. It's still a religious experience for her, because my church is here.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Now, like I said, it resonates with a very modern kind of mentality about sort of working through the problematics of institutional religion, and then figuring out how one can still maintain a sense of religious experience, religiosity, if you like, in your own domain without having to subscribe to things you may not necessarily or don't feel right to you.
And that's hard.
It is very
for a 19th century small town woman.
Yes. Yes.
It takes a lot of guts.
Mm.
Everybody around you is kind of conforming.
Which, yeah,
and she's saying no.
She's very strong-minded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's easy to be strong. I'm going to throw this out. It's easy to be strong-minded. You are in many ways cloistered in your home, and the show's run by your father.
Right.
And I don't mean to sort of in any way take from that experience that Dickinson was having, so she could have these experiences, I think, because she had the luxury to do so. She was well fed, she was well educated. Anything was at her disposal when it came to education and learning and reading especially. And all of that was funded by a father.
You know, this is I can't help the the what analogy, if you like.
Yeah.
The what was the word you used? The support structure, the foundation for her, the strength, the what gave her the confidence, reassurance.
Yeah.
The Father.
Yeah. Yeah. Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost.
Well, yeah, I mean, there you go. So
also,
I think that is beautiful.
Yeah.
I don't mean that.
But like, I don't want to take away from the fact that
no,
you know that what we have here, the end product of Dickinson here, is not such. You know, it's beautiful. It gives us something to reflect on ourselves. But I'm interested in the Father and how much he really supports that.
Yeah.
And that it does begin as early as 6 and 7 years old, when he subscribes to those religiously flavored magazines, because he was not often at home. He would travel a lot. He would travel a lot to Boston. He would travel for work. He eventually became not absent or non-existent. He was still there in letter form, but he would be absent physically for months on end. And this was his way of trying to tap back in to his authority, or to ensure that his children were getting something from him, that he had some sort of say in how they were going to be steered in the right direction. And it was the job of the parents to ensure that their kids were steered in the right direction at the time. They were as it is with probably any family and household, even today, it's the first few years guided by parent, education, and then it depends. This father was trying in some ways to do right by his children. But yeah, I had to sort of say that because as Dickinson scholars are aware of it as well, it's the father gives her a lot to work with, and a home to stay in, because why would you want to get married? Because you're moving from one paternal environment to another paternal environment. And Dickinson seems to be very adamant about using this space to her advantage, staying at home. Her sister didn't marry either, so the two of them really were left alone. But they were a lot older. When her mother died in 75, I think it was, 75 or 76.
Yeah.
She was already in her mid-40s.
Wow. So, you know what? There's so much in that.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you threw it out there, because I think we're going to have to. I mean, for me, again, as thinking about this from a religious studies perspective, as someone who's kind of constantly thinking about these issues, to me, that reference point, that data that you just presented, that information, a key piece of information, relationship with the father to the daughters, the safety and security in their home that was provided for them, the means that was provided. I mean, perhaps, and this, I'm just throwing this out there, it's a wild thought, but I think that's a very significant underpinning for understanding Emily Dickinson as a religious person, but non-status quo, not institutionalized. That doesn't sound good, does it?
Not denominational, I guess.
Not not bent to the will of the institutional religious organization, but somehow kept in the spirit of the faith, and that spirit of the faith is kept alive within her world that is allowed to exist because of her father. And I'm just going to emphasize the father more. I really think this, to me, the gut feeling is go to the father, and I think this relationship between them is amazing.
It's amazing
because that whole scenario, like cloistered, unmarried, it speaks for itself.
Yes, it does.
She's deeply, deeply profound, spiritual, thoughtful person. And then she has this tremendous relationship with a father who's there but not there.
There but not there.
Again, the sort of cliche, symbolic,
distant, stately lover.
Right.
Which is how she describes God. God is a distant, stately lover.
Well, the ever transcendent but present God.
That's right.
So God's presence is not away from us in many literature, mystical in particular. Though go on, try and pinpoint where he is or what he is, it's near impossible.
Right.
Thus the nature of mysticism. Going way back to the Dionysian mysteries and so on and so forth. And then obviously
it's not this, God is not that.
The negative theology.
Prophetic, tradition.
And same you find in Sufism, a lot of that exists. So I think it's what we've kind of stumbled across and speaking about here is really kind of important, I think, in a very beautiful way. That you could kind of speak about, that I will forever, I think, remember Emily Dickinson this way. In a way that's different to when you're just trying to come at it very empirically and just kind of, right, what is the relationship with her and Calvinism? Okay, like this. And what is the relationship with her and religion? Well, like this. I think something more intimate and beautiful and human is happening here that defines religion for me.
Okay.
And the way that I see religion, that is profound, mysterious, ineffable. And I'm running out of words here.
That's okay. You're right.
I've done enough. It's a Persian trait, you just have to emphasize. It's like, Dad, you've said it too many times already. I'm sorry. I have children, and I kind of, I'm obviously that's resonating with me. This kind of, I have daughters, I have a young boy, son, and I love them all with every ounce of my being, and I don't want to ever interfere in their lives, but I kind of want to steer them in a way that I think will serve them, without being like dominating. So you have to, you make sure. So I think my daughter's already kind of annoyed at me for suggesting readings.
Well, it can't be helped that when it comes to offspring, we are trying in some ways to do what we probably didn't get from our parents, our fathers, and we might be fumbling it up in the process. And I see in Edward Dickinson's father, a little bit of that, because the relationship with Dickinson later on, especially, it was I would imagine there was a lot of rifts, and you could see it in the letters. It wasn't in one of the letters that she writes to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, he asks for an image of her, like a photo.
Yeah.
But she says, would you believe I don't have any? My father doesn't allow us. It doesn't allow me to be photographed. We know that there is one confirmed daguerreotype of her when she was 17. There's speculation about other photos that have floated about, whether it is her or not. We can't really tell. I mean, there's a science there that could probably figure that out and could say, yeah, it might be her. But the impression that this editor, Thomas Higginson, had of the father when he visits Dickinson in the 70s, 1870s, early 1870, 71, was that he was very severe, or it appeared to be very severe and rigid. And yes, we do get that impression about him.
Yes.
Because even Dickinson's biographers give that impression off about her father. Was rigid, and he was very severe and didn't have probably much of a sense of humor. Which is why I think that Dickinson's humor kind of is a default for her, coming out of that kind of rigid,
makes sense, yeah,
almost very conservative father figure. And maybe that's the image that she also has of a God as well, translated through this image of her father. I can't say that it's accurate to make that assumption, but you could certainly see it, that there is. I'm interested in that early father who was reading quite a lot, and he was reading about how to instruct his children. And obviously the mother would have been aware of that too, who was reading Paisley's philosophy, I think it is, so that he could understand what role does he play in educating his children. What role can he possibly play? Given absences, there's a lot of guilt there. And you could sense it in his letters to his wife. His job keeps taking him away.
Yeah.
And he can't really help it. I mean, he wasn't the only father that was away for weeks on end. But how he substitutes or tries to compensate is interesting.
Yes.
That makes him human. Early sort of literature, scholarly literature, often kind of concentrated on Dickinson's ailments and or psychological ailments resulting out of the father, and the father's treatment of her.
Sounds Freudian. Very
Freudian. But I think Dickinson scholarship has come a long way since that literature, and I think it's sort of tapping into a Dickinson who is a lot more three-dimensional, complex, because we go through phases in life, and but also very much, aware of her world, and her surrounds, not just her immediate world in that house, but also the world outside of that house. And I think that's where those subscriptions played an enormous role. This was her internet.
I got that sense from reading your paper.
This is it, and it says a lot about her. She was not unaware of that world, but what she cherry picked as well, I think. And I think part of the reason also why she kind of felt that she couldn't kind of confirm this religion that she was born into, or confirm that Christ has saved her from, damnation in any way, was because, once you introduce somebody, even from a very young, vulnerable age, to the possibility of other ways of thinking, other religions out there, you're opening them up to question.
Right.
and interrogate.
The sense I got though from your paper was that the intention, obviously of the magazines, I'm not quite sure about the father, was to yeah, he's the world, kids. It's all these amazing things, but you see how it sort of falls short of our faith,
Yes,
right?
yes,
And so don't forget our faith.
yes. So
Come
don't
back,
forget our
be
faith. Yes,
confirmed.
absolutely.
Yeah,
But I think Dickinson had that inquisitive mind,
yeah. So that
so
was enough for
inquisitive
her.
that she wasn't like her
Yeah,
sister Vinnie or
yeah,
her brother Austin.
yeah,
As a middle child, she was there to fend for herself and think for herself. And I think she had that capacity to do that, to look at these articles, whether it was an article about some kid on their deathbed,
yeah. Jeez.
you know, uh, praising, Christ for
Yeah,
and begging to die to see Christ
yes.
and be saved. Or it was a story about some child converting from Islam or from Hinduism or Buddhism
Yeah,
to Christianity.
yeah,
I think whatever Dickinson was reading, if she was reading these magazines that her uncle sent her, and we know that she sent them a package to thank them for them. Possibly they sent more subscriptions to her. So she would have been reading something. And if she was reading these
yeah,
stories, she was more than likely digesting it,
yeah,
but also interrogating into it.
yeah,
Given the nature of her mind, given what we see of her inquisitiveness, and her oscillations, her waverings, between this idea of God as being distant, God and being a lover.
yeah,
I would have to imagine that in those early days, she was doing a lot of that questioning, reading the Sabbath School Visitor, reading Parley's magazine.
yeah,
But also taking in and enjoying what she was reading, because they were affirming for her that home was a beautiful place.
yeah,
And you can travel.
yeah,
Even while you're in your armchair.
yeah,
Enjoying a lovely read.
yeah,
So I think there was, as an impressionable 6 or 7-year-old, she would have possibly been thinking about a lot of this, growing up with some of that still in mind. She mentions a lot of that even later in life. Parley's magazine pops up in one of her early Peter Parley pops up in one of her early poems. So something would have stayed. The sea metaphors that we read about a lot, sea voyages, sea narratives that appear quite heavily in a lot of these narratives. And also that whole idea of drowning in the sea,
yeah,
on voyage, en route to something, or coming back, is it was done deliberately to suggest,
yeah,
again, losing one's faith. Or if you lost your faith, then you were likely to you're a marker of somebody who's drowning. A lot of that comes into her early letters and also into those early poems. I see metaphors translate in some way, or they manifest in some way in her poetry. And you could see a connection, whether it's deliberate or it's a remembrance of, there's some sort of connection. As a reader, you can see it, that is. So yeah, it's home is sweet, and she says it herself, and I wouldn't give it away for anything. And she couldn't even understand why people would leave home to mission to other countries, or why any of her peers or her brother or her sister-in-law would want to leave. Home, there's nothing better than home. This is where everything happens. It can make or break you, but it's where everything happens.
No, I like home. I'm a home person too. So I think home is sweet, especially it's where you want to be.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So there's nothing like home. I do like traveling, but home is always just nice. just really nice.
It's really nice. I also think that in many ways, by being at home, she became like what many migrants do when they travel from their countries to another land, but they retain a lot of their existing principles and values, beliefs of their institution, and it's almost frozen in time. Their beliefs are frozen in time. Their cultural practices are frozen in time.
That's right.
And I think that's what happens to Dickinson as well by staying home. She's frozen in time, and that her beliefs are there. She believes. I mean, I think her father had asked Reverend Jenkins to assess her because he was probably a little bit, he was questioning possibly, is she on path to being saved? The verdict coming out of having sat down, possibly talking with Dickinson, because we don't know what he would have discussed with her.
Right.
The only verdict coming out of it was that she's sound.
Oh, well, that's good.
That's good. So father clearly was concerned for her.
Right. Well, I mean, if you're the only one not confirmed, right? Obviously it's going to be a concern for the community.
And the community at large, as well as the immediate family.
And it impacts the father, who's in the eye of the community.
Yeah.
What kind of household are you running, mate?
Yeah.
Why isn't your daughter confirmed?
Mm.
Why hasn't she converted yet? What's going on? So yeah, I can feel that pressure.
Yeah.
Even from how many centuries?
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
centuries. Yeah.
Yeah. It is.
So we're far away from that time, but I can still feel the pressure.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong, nothing worse than people's judgment on you even from a distance. You can feel it. It's awful. It's like, mind your business, man.
Well, she was the myth of Amherst. Eventually,
Right.
she became the myth
There you
of
go.
Amherst.
Wow.
Yeah,
love it. Shall we have a look at the mystical poem?
Yeah.
Just as the last one, and then we'll move on.
Yeah.
I think
Sounds
I want
great.
to hear some of your poems.
Okay.
All right. So this one doesn't have a title, obviously.
No, but it's the first.
Normally known as.
Yeah, the first line goes, "God gave a loaf to every bird."
All right, let's read it. Well, would you like to read it, please?
If you want to, you can read it.
Or do you want me to read it?
If you want to.
Okay. God gave a loaf to every bird, but just a crumb to me. I dare not eat it, though I starve, my poignant luxury. To own it, touch it, prove the feat that made the pellet mine, too happy for my sparrow's chance, for ampler coveting. It might be famine all round, I could not miss an ear, such plenty smiles upon my board, my garner shows so fair. I wonder how the rich may feel, an Indian man, an earl. I deem that I, with but a crumb, am sovereign of them all. Wow. That's a nice one.
Yeah, and she does have quite a few poems that use that whole idea of starvation, the crumb, the
What is
bread.
this about? Do you want to unpack it for us? Yeah, go.
Yeah, I will. And thirst. So
Okay.
This is what I call a Eucharistic poem.
Uh-huh.
In the sense that you could probably couple these poems about the crumb with a lot of the poems about the Eucharist and or the wine when she mentions wine or when she mentions thirst.
Yep.
Hunger and thirst are very key
Hunger
features.
for the body and blood of Christ.
The body and blood of Christ. But this is happening aside from that institutional practice. So she's talking about it almost as though it's something that she does daily, or it is a process.
Wow.
For her.
Okay.
God gave a loaf to every bird, but just a crumb to me is a really interesting turn of phrase. Because she's quite satisfied with the crumb.
Yes.
Though she doesn't eat it. So she doesn't eat the crumb.
Why?
Well, I guess for me, it's because it's almost like she is, what's the word? You abstain.
Okay, yeah,
You abstain. She's
yes.
abstaining.
And what gives you the suggestion that she doesn't eat it?
I dare not eat it.
Oh, sorry.
That I starve.
Silly question.
No.
Salt, edit that out. I'm joking. I'm joking. Don't let everyone see. I can make a fool of myself, and I'm perfectly happy with it.
Did it?
So she doesn't eat it because she's abstaining. I think that's a powerful point. Why is she abstaining? What is her thinking behind this? She doesn't want to partake of the Eucharist.
Yeah.
Okay, so she's making a point, which is
But I think also she's distinguishing between the loaf and the crumb, because I feel that the loaf is representative of the Eucharist.
Okay.
But the crumb is different.
Right.
It's like she's being almost shortchanged in some ways. But
Okay.
she's happy to be shortchanged. She kind of refuses to eat the crumb because
Okay.
there's something far more powerful in not eating it. She's not saying that I am refusing the Eucharist.
Yep.
I refuse it because there's something far more powerful in doing so. Even though I starve, there's something powerful in the starvation, in the starving, the fasting.
Yeah.
If we want to,
Well, fasting's powerful
very powerful
in the spiritual tradition.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
it's Lent right now and
Yes.
Ramadan
And we're starving.
double whammy. No, yeah, absolutely. Fasting is an integral part of the spiritual tradition.
Yes, yes. And it just reminds me, this poem reminds me, and a lot of these poems that she's writing and toying with this idea of, here's the crumb, God gave the crumb to me, but I refuse to eat. I'm fast. It's almost like I'm fasting.
Yeah.
But I'm fasting a lot longer than a lot of everyone else is doing. You know, who's taking the loaf to every bird? The birds eat the loaf.
Yes.
But I kind of refuse to eat. I continue on in the fasting process because you find something incredibly rewarding in fasting. The longer you fast.
Right. So for her, this might have meant, I mean, I don't dare to presume to understand anything about Eucharistic practices of the Calvinist church,
Right.
whichever version we're talking about. As I said, I'm much more familiar with Eastern Christian ritual, Byzantine rite and its rituals. And is she, in her context, in her mind, in her understanding of whatever the Eucharist represents in that tradition, her tradition, so her not partaking it is part of her not submitting and converting. Is that tie in with that?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. That possibly
Did you hear that?
Yeah,
I made a good. I have redeemed.
That's a great point. I think yeah, it's a way of, I guess, doing two things when she says that. One, it is a way of not participating in that institutional practice. But then in choosing not to participate, I feel like she has not discovered, she has realized there's something powerful about.
Yeah, going back to your point, because that power of resisting and continuing the fast, even in, as I understand the my reading of the Desert Fathers and Eastern tradition, that the ascesis practice, the strict monastic routine is to abstain, to fast for as long as possible, and this is how you build up the power.
Yes.
Right. Whereas the lay are permitted to commune, to partake of the Eucharist, even during Lent, at significant times of the week, even more regularly, perhaps. And so this is interesting because you're breaking the fast.
You're breaking the fast, yes.
Yeah, but so I love your point about this kind of resisting.
Yes.
And to sort of building up this power that she's.
Well, it is. It's a resistance.
It is, yeah.
It is a resistance, because when we look at the second and third stanza, to, she owns it and she touches this crumb to prove that the feet that pellet is mine. She touches it to see that it is hers. It is hers. Too happy for my sparrow's chance for ampler coveting, but even the touching could potentially present the temptation.
Yes. Yes.
Because I would have to assume that someone like Dickinson, who is aware of these practices, and she would have been aware of the practices of fasting, and the communion and the wine. She talks about it regularly enough to say she knows. But I would assume that she also knows what's tied to doing it your way, or possibly even not only doing it your way, but doing it a way that hasn't been offered to you. So if God gives a crumb to you, are you resisting because it's out of a kind of recalcitrance, or are you resisting because the outcome will be better for you,
right? Okay.
Spiritually, emotionally? I don't think it's a resistance because she's rebelling, because rebellion has a certain type of connotation.
I don't get that sense either. Yeah.
I think it's a resistance because I think she sees something there in the prolonged fasting.
Okay.
In a prolonged fasting. I might be famine, she says.
Yeah.
All around. It might be famine, sorry, all around. I could not miss an ear, such plenty smiles upon my board, my garnish showed so fair. I wonder how the rich may feel, an Indiaman, an earl. I deem that I with but a crumb, and sovereign of them all. And I understand sovereignty here. You could kind of explain it different ways, but if every bird represents the congregation,
yep.
and you are this individual who's resisting the pull to the congregation,
yes,
being pulled into that congregation, then what's on the other end of that resistance? It's a different experience. What does that experience look like? It's far more richer, perhaps, than is she being bombastic? I don't know. Far more richer than taking the Eucharist at hand, and then walking away from it. Whereas prolonging it, there's something more that comes out of it. And I'm thinking here in terms as well of the visionaries, the mystics in the Middle Ages who did prolong their fasts well beyond the recommended by priests and by the church, to the point where they were considered as practices of heretics. But what that did, at least for the female visionaries, at least, was it would the prolonged fast would bring on visions.
Of course.
Which I've never experienced it, so I don't know.
That's great.
But the prolonged the prolonged fasting.
Edit that. No.
The prolonged fasting.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
Possibly brings something more that is there in the lines, but that she doesn't reveal, except in saying that I am sovereign of even the Indianman.
So do you think she has had those visions? Would you be willing to?
There is literature.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, I still do remember the author's name. Angela Conrad wrote a whole text talking about the potential there.
Okay.
Looking at some of these poems from the point of view of a visionary.
Right. Okay.
That there was something there to suggest.
Forgive me for not asking this from the beginning, but I mean, for me, it was a revelation to discover by accident how much Dickinson, there's religion in Dickinson, how much religion and Dickinson relate to each other, especially through poetry. And I feel like such a fool for not even putting the dots together and poetry, you know. But it was an awesome moment, and I realized this, and then I got very excited about talking to you. Is there, do people normally, scholars, look at Dickinson as a kind of a spiritual figure?
There's scholarship that certainly
Like a visionary? Or is that going too far? Yeah.
that is going too far. I mean,
okay.
She is a visionary in that kind of creative sense.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the spiritual sense, I think I remember receiving feedback on some of my work in this area, and the feedback was interesting, and I think looking at it from more mature eyes, I could see the reality behind it as well. Sorry, what was that?
I never liked feedback.
Oh, that's
From
okay.
journal review.
It can make or break you. Sometimes it's broken me, but that's okay. The argument is that, well, we can't the visionary tradition is often tied to the Catholic tradition for the majority of when we look at the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I'm thinking Julian of Norwich. I'm thinking of
Hadwich of Antwerp. There's Hildegard of Bingen, Teresa of Avila. It's predominantly Catholic. There might have been, a couple of, Protestants that I remember vaguely, but not within the visionary tradition. And so the feedback on that is Dickinson's awareness of that tradition would have been scant.
Okay.
Even in some of the research that I did at the newspaper and the periodicals, it wasn't so prolific. You get quite a lot of discussions about other religions, but the Middle Ages and the visionaries, female visionaries especially, was not something that was discussed or widely circulated. So her it's very unlikely that she would have been aware, therefore, of the mystics.
Okay.
Even of Meister Eckhart or Dionysius, the Areopagite.
Yes.
Plotinus maybe, because she was reading Plato, but again, not 100% sure. And so when we think about visionary here, she's working with her own existing tradition, and the kind of institutional knowledge behind the practices of the Eucharist. And through her own knowledge of that, I think she's independently exploring terrain that looks almost very similar to what we read of these visionary female mystics of the Middle Ages.
That's great.
Especially with these poems.
Yeah.
These particular poems are really interesting because it's the act of starving, the act of fasting is widely discussed or widely kind of explored by the female visionary mystics. The idea of fasting for weeks, sometimes months, which is a tremendous feat in itself. I'm not saying that that's what Dickinson did, but also given her ailments, given her illnesses, there probably would have been occasions where she was familiar with not wanting to eat, not wanting to participate in that whole process of digesting.
But she never describes a vision in any of the poems that you know of, mystical vision or spiritual experience of sorts.
Well, there's a lot of flies and funerals and brains collapsing. I don't know whether those are visionary, and I know that you had touched on that as a potential. I felt A Funeral in My Brain as a potential poem that taps into that kind of transcendence, and there is the possibility for that. There's definitely possibility.
Right.
If you go as far back as, I think, Genevieve Taggart, who was one of her earlier biographers, tapped into that idea of her being a mystic.
Okay.
Louise Bogan also has tapped into that idea of Dickinson being a mystic.
So, but mystic perhaps qualified in the sense that, I mean, not in the traditional sense of a mystic,
not in
like
the traditional sense. Yes,
mystic.
that's right. And so that's where it gets a little bit interesting, whereas the Angela Conrad argument is a really not really interesting one, because it taps into those medieval discourses that it doesn't kind of let Dickinson flounder out into a mysticism that's more modern. And there has been writings there that have focused on Dickinson's apophatic tendencies. Which are really interesting. That whole idea of her, that oscillation between the negative and the affirmative in her writing is really interesting too. We could see that here, that paradoxical owning of crumb, but refraining from consuming it, and what that signifies for her. I think to me, it's the crumb is God in this poem.
Okay, that's powerful.
The crumb is God. And she recognizes that in consuming God, you're turning the ineffable into something that you're reifying the ineffable. You're trying to make sense of it, where holding stop.
She doesn't want to do that.
She doesn't want to do that.
Yeah.
I feel like she doesn't want to do that. She wants to hold out from doing that. And then in the other poem that I included, which was Yes, Art Thou the Thing I Wanted.
Yes.
I like the way that one ends.
Please read that.
Art thou the thing I wanted? Begone, my tooth has grown. Supply the mine a palate that has not starved so long. I tell thee, while I waited, the mystery of food increased till I abjured it and dine without my God. There's another rewriting of this poem where she ends with, and dine without, subsisting now like God.
Oh.
So there's a slight difference
to
the last line.
What do you take that to mean?
I think it's an interesting difference. One says subsisting now like God, the other one says to dine without like God. One seems to suggest that to dine without is to imply that you are like God.
To dine as in eating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eating without. See, this is interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting.
Is she saying to dine without like God? Or is she saying to dine without whatever food it is? The practice itself is like God.
Yeah, that's right. That's how I would read it.
Yeah. Okay. Because it gets interesting. And when she tells us in the alteration that she makes, so this is Franklin poem 1311 A, and then B, subsisting now like God. So to dine without means that you are living now like God, right, in that second that second version of the poem.
Right. Love it.
There's something that she gains in renouncing food.
So you've got here, I think, if I may read, I'll just signal to, and maybe you can see. Dickinson's fasting poem seems to be saying something similar, except she takes the middleman, in parentheses Christ, out of the equation here.
Takes us back to some keep the Sabbath.
Yes.
By going to church, I keep it while staying at home. And what I have is, nature around me and this an orchard for a dome. And what I was saying before was that there's no middleman.
Yeah.
Whether that be the clergyman, or it's the clergyman preaching about Christ, or it's Christ himself, she takes that out of the equation. And what I find interesting about it is that she almost as though doesn't want that middleman.
Yeah.
At least in these poems that we've looked at.
Yeah.
And so she's looking up or living like in this instance, like God. Yeah. And there is no mediator. Which is what Christianity is. It's Christ is the mediator to God in many ways.
I think
Be as I am.
Yeah. No, I mean, I totally.
So that you are closer to God. do as I do, which is a wonderful instruction. You know, it's like I preach about love. I'm full of compassion. Consider the lilies, and you'll be fine. But she was, and like I said, she, you know, the Bible was read by her father every night, a chapter a night, and so she's learnt that Bible thoroughly.
Yes.
So when she rephrases or pulls out phrases from the Bible, she's doing it from memory. So when you read a lot of it in her letters, it might not come out accurately. And when we're talking about what Bible, we're talking about the King James Version, which is not an easy read.
I've got one.
Yeah, it's not an, so have I, and it's not an easy read. And she kind of digests it, and then and it comes out in different ways in her writing. And so she will ponder on a lot of this stuff that Christ talks about. She likes the human Christ. Well, she likes Jesus. Because he's human and he's flawed.
I mean, that's I mean, I don't know. I'm no expert on theology, but I'm again, I sort of read more mystics than I do theologians. So
Yes.
my understanding, again, it's kind of filtered or conditioned by that sort of mind of the mystic. Mediator kind of strikes me as a little bit awkward.
Yeah.
So I understand Christ as God incarnate according to doctrine.
Yes.
Therefore, he is God.
Yes.
The face of God.
Yes.
God in the flesh.
Yeah.
In human form to relate to us in a human way.
Yeah.
Which brings back Dickinson. And I find that really powerful, really, really beautiful. And it's the kind of the ultimate expression of God's compassion in the Christian doctrinal sense. To then demonstrate that he does care and he does want us to be with him. I'm now starting to sound a little bit but yeah, I mean, obviously the invitation is there, and then he's kind of relating to us that way. And so there's a powerful way for me in the way that I understand it, that it sort of, it's not really a mediation like it, but it is like, I'm thinking obviously of the line, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father but by me. So obviously that has the sense of mediation, like come through me to the Father. And the early Christianity certainly has that sense, and perhaps the Protestant evangelical sort of revives that. So
well, that's the point of the revivals. It was about, you know, you recognizing that there is this figure in our faith that you want to fall back on.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
So, and I guess maybe this is coming back to the Calvinist thing. I think maybe it's just not really a thing. I mean, if she had met some, I don't know, Christian mystics, perhaps she might have got along better. I'm going out on a limb here. I'm not a Dickinson scholar.
Not that Thoreau or Emerson were mystics in the strictest of sense, but was it Thoreau or Emerson? Don't quote me on this one, I can't remember. Was entertained next door by her sister-in-law. So they were you know, she would entertain quite a lot of writers and well-known figures. She was very close in proximity to them, and she read them widely.
Okay.
So she one of, you know, her first introductions to Emerson was by her tutor, her 8 tutor, who gave her a series of Emerson's poems. So she read them widely. And I think if you're going to get close to tying Dickinson in any way to a tradition or being privy to certain traditions like mysticism or any other faiths like Hinduism or Buddhism, it would be through this secondhand access to other writers who were dabbling in contemporary writers of her time who were dabbling into these ways of thinking, to these other institutions, other ways of looking at the world. but her directly, yeah, I don't think that there is substantial evidence to say. In many ways, I think there's something organic
Yeah,
about
that
it.
is absolute the feeling I
That
get.
there is nothing that
Oh,
what she's experiencing there that is necessarily unique to her, but it's unique insofar as it has some sort of premise in history, in religious history, or in other writers. And you could see it in other writers that they're the ones that you can make that kind of comparison to, whether they be mystics or whether they be, poets. It's there because she was so widely read. The Bible itself is, her doorway in to a lot of this, because a lot of these mystics were, in fact, drawn to Catholic sort of, mystics were drawn to that work of literature, you can say. And it's more than literature, it has this kind of, presence, especially when you are tapping into that part of the mind that wants to transcend beyond the immediate word. And I think that's her way of trying to get into a way of writing into this kind of tradition, a way of thinking. I'm probably fumbling that one up a little bit, but
I
yeah.
get it. No, I think the point is basically that it certainly seems to me to be the case that she is, for want of a better word, an organic mystic, a natural
Yeah.
mystic. Sounds like a
Yes.
Bob Marley song.
Yeah.
Mystic. I think there's a line in. I love Bob Marley songs, but Bob Marley's music. Yeah, I think that's kind of the idea, right? And that she may not be officially classified as a mystic or a religious individual, but certainly very organically so.
Yeah.
In her own way.
Yeah.
A unique, distinctive way.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Why don't we have a look at some of your poems?
Okay.
I think let's do we could probably talk all day about Dickinson.
Yeah,
I mean,
we
for me,
could.
this is an amazingly new. I'm exploring, I'm learning so much. So thank you for spending the time with me.
Oh no, thank you. It's like I said to you, and if I can say it here, that it's prompted me to get back to this research, which has stalled, and it stalled primarily because of the C word, which I don't want to repeat. COVID.
Oh, the C word, yes. So have you got these to
Yeah, I do.
Oh, great. So let's would you like to read?
Yeah, this is called Easter Poem. And
From your cicada.
Yeah, from my collection called Cicada Chimes. I have to say that this collection has probably a lot more religious, what I would call religious artifacts, the one that's coming up. But I do write quite a bit of Easter poems. And okay.
I want to read them.
Oh, okay. And it's only because yeah, it's and one of the reasons is because generally speaking, I would go to church with mum, and mum's not capable anymore, and so it's always an interesting experience because we would be there for the duration, and until her legs would get tired, and then we would leave, and often I would take my little red book, very appropriate notebook, and I would write poems while I was in church. Sometimes before the service, Easter service would start, sometimes during the Easter service. And a lot of these poems are written.
Dickinson of you.
How very Dickinson of me, yes. Yes. Writing on everything and anything available.
And why, may I ask? You said there's a lot more collection of artifacts, religious artifacts. Is this kind of like personal processing? You're working through things.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay. Always working through things. Okay. Always working through things. And I've got ones that I've written that I'm not putting into the new collection because I want to create a collection that looks at a timeline of all of that. And yeah, there's quite a bit of Easter poems. I'm even thinking of just writing a collection of just Easter poems. But yeah, it's yeah, they're sort of important moments of reflection. When I go to church, it's time to reflect, and it's always about turning in. It's not about turning out.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%.
Easter poem. Another resurrection on the street, listening to the congregation snort at ushers, queue jumpers, teenagers with iPhones, rising candle prices, coin collectors who count clinks with suspicious eyes. It's 11:40 p.m. Too late to secure a seat inside. Too cloudy to enjoy the moon, the stars. This year, girls in black dresses and high heels wear makeup. Boys in suit jackets as young as 5 wear hair gel. The only party they'll attend following tonight's service will include a bowl of lemony green soup made from lamb's guts and liver, red-dyed eggs, hard-boiled, and Yaya's whispery kisses. She'll stay up late and tell stories about the old country to rolling eyes. In the thickening crowd, a little girl appears agitated. Dimpled fingers crank around the ribbon on her hand, a candle. She's been waiting for the priest to emerge from his cave of shadows, or like the others who arrive late and stand outside, the wait takes place in something resembling Dante's vestibule. Limbs fall prey to stings and bites. Mummy, my legs hurt. Not much longer to go, sweetie. Mother's voice is tender, persuasive. Inside, the priest signs God is love on the minds of every sinner with faded ink and incense. His voice trembles through the loudspeaker. Paschal vigil culminates in a brief litany before surrounding lights are extinguished. I come for the ritual. We all do. The sight of the holy flame as it multiplies to hundreds, thousands, millions. The resounding bell at midnight. The song, Christ is risen from the dead, chanted 12 times. Fireworks graffiti the night sky. You'd think it's New Year's. Candles glow resplendent under milky street lights. They motion through darkness like electric ghosts. It's needed, this ritual. We cannot get into our cars and drive home. We cannot burn the cross above our doorways. We cannot eat our lamb's guts and liver soup without the belief that God watches our every move.
I love it. I really love this poem. Do you want to read?
I'm very cynical of my congregation.
I think
Not
that's
just
very
in this
healthy.
poem, but yeah, I
I think
understand.
every parishioner is
Yeah.
cynical of the congregation.
And look, the thing is, I've been studying. I was first introduced to Dickinson in my 3rd year as an undergrad, and I did my honors on Dickinson. I did my PhD on Dickinson, so I've been with Dickinson for 20 plus years. And I don't know whether I was or not I was attracted to her because I have the same leanings, or whether or not she's rubbed off on me. I don't know, but I'm cynical of my congregation.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Probably less so now than what I was when I first wrote this poem.
Yeah.
I was single. I was, no children, no family, and I'm looking at the congregation from a different perspective now. But having said that, it is indeed just my cynicism coming out here.
But it's still very tasteful.
Yeah.
It's very it's kind of controlled. You can see the power behind it and feel it. But at the same time, it's not holding back, saying things that needs to be said. You're describing it so beautifully.
Thank you.
And it just makes me smile, the iPhones, coin collectors, everyone's dressed up, all of that. Yeah,
Yeah.
love it. Is there anything about it you want to unpack or?
No, I think it's hard to unpack one's it's not
It is. I get
hard
that.
to unpack one's own work. I mean, to me, looking at it from the point of view of a speaker writing this poem, is that there is the side of faith that keeps this poem together, because while there is that term and that use of the word ritual, ritual is heavily tied with practices of faith.
Yeah.
It is heavily tied with your belief and belief system, and how you adopt those practices, how you apply them to your day-to-day life. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, what happens at Easter is that the after Good Friday, so Good Friday hits, and then Saturday midnight going into Sunday, there is a service. Service then lasts for hours if you stick around. And it is a beautiful service. I hadn't stuck around at a young age past the midnight point. I have since then, and it's a beautiful service. The priest comes out of the church, and because many of the congregation kind of gathered together outside of the church, there's not enough room inside. Most are just pretty much there the last 5, maybe 15 minutes of the service, just looking to take the light, take it home.
Yeah.
And what we tend to do is we kind of just light the doorways as you enter in, and then you light your candelabra or whatever next to your icons.
Right.
And then that's supposed to bring some sort of, a good intentions to the home. But I want to pull away from that.
Oh.
I mean, I've stopped doing that.
Yeah.
There's been a couple of ideas. It's the ritual I'm pulling away from.
Right.
It's that obsessive compulsive need to say, I've got to take this home.
Okay, yeah.
I remember one Easter when I was with my husband and my daughter, and we took the light to the car, and I extinguished it. And my daughter said to me, we're not taking this home. No, we're not taking this home. That's it. We were there for the service. We were there to absorb the service, reflect, meditate, and move on.
Wow.
We did the ritual last year, which was really exciting.
Yep.
Because we stayed around for quite a bit of time after the service. But this is the thing that I'm interested in, is at what point does what you do step into this kind of obsessive compulsive need to do it because it has to be done?
Yep.
And can you pull yourself back and enter back into that territory where it is about the faith?
Yep.
Because to me, I'll call it rather than ritual, I'll call it the obsessive compulsive need versus the faith. I think those two are constantly at odds with each other to some extent. And you're, as an individual who's stepping into a religion and practicing it,
yep.
I know for myself, I'm always at tug of wars with the two of them, especially the older I get and the more that I question. There's always, well, is this me being ritualistic or am I being faithful? Which one is it? I'm constantly questioning. And there are times where I let it go.
Yeah.
Times where I will extinguish the light in the car. Or I will say, it's okay. It doesn't have to come home with me. It's not going to be a bad year if it doesn't.
Well, no.
Right, exactly. But this is what I'm saying. There's that tendency as well, because I'm riddled with anxiety, riddled with, nervousness. You could see how certain practices in religion can become overly ritualistic, to the point where letting it go is tied with God loving you. And that's not the case. I remember my uncle saying, and he's now since departed, so God rest his soul, as people say.
He's in repose.
He's in repose. Saying to me when I think I was fasting, and I had commented, I can't remember on whether or not someone had been swearing or not, and he says, it's, or not commented on that, rather I had said something along the lines of fasting, and I was talking about ritual and the need for the ritual. And he says, Helen, it doesn't matter what you put in your mouth. It's what comes out of the mouth. That's the most important thing.
Very true.
And ever since, I've never forgotten that. Ever since then, I started thinking, okay, this is very interesting. I can think of things in a different way here. I don't have to necessarily buy into everything. And it's not about buying, it's about being allowed, giving yourself permission to question certain practices. And I remember him even saying, God doesn't care about what goes in. It's what's coming out. That vile sort of stuff that might come out.
Yeah.
Because he never fasted, from what I know.
Well,
never did.
Yeah.
And I could be wrong about that, but those lovely words that came out of his mouth stuck. And I will never forget them. Because it always keeps me there, remembering, just don't put yourself in a position where you are buying in and getting locked in.
Yeah.
Buying is not the right word, but that's still.
No, I get it. It's just something has happened with the sound, but I think it's working nevertheless. I think we've reached. I had to give this app, but anyway,
okay.
It's kind of reached its free limitations. Now it's being overlaid. I don't know what that means, but hopefully it sounds okay. It's still recording. I wanted to say too, just I think that's a really powerful point you make, and the words of your uncle. For what it's worth, I think I remember reading something in Sufi literature, but also just to be relevant in Desert Fathers, and I can't remember which of the fathers it was that says this. That in fact fasting can become, I don't know if I'm wording this correctly, the tool of the devil.
Yeah.
It can become a temptation or a pride, a form of pride in itself.
Yeah.
So it's not about the fasting.
Yeah.
I think that was the message of the saying.
Yeah.
Though fasting is important and powerful, as we already said, discussing it with regards to Dickinson's poem. But I think if it overtakes you and makes you into this demonic being, which foul things keep coming out of your mouth and you're violent and horrible to people or whatever, just for the sake of the ritual, then I think something's wrong there. And I think that's what the saying was trying to communicate, though I don't remember.
You said it better.
No, I did not.
The sake of the ritual. And that's the reality of it. Balance.
Balance. You can't, like you say, it's the tug of war between the faith and the compulsive behavior.
Yeah.
Which kind of religious ritual really does to you, in a way. But if you forget the faith, the core essence of why you're doing the ritual, then you're doing just your monkey business. It's just European. You're just doing stuff, whatever. It could be anything. Yeah. Right. The faith. Right. That's why you're doing it. If you're going to do it.
Yes.
And you could do, I guess, different things. You could be Catholic, you could be Orthodox, you could be
Protestant,
Lutheran.
Lutheran.
I'm going to drop this in for Zolt because he loves Lutheranism. So you could be any Buddhist, Muslim. You have rituals, right? And you're doing those things, but you have intention behind them. You have the faith that supports that. Otherwise, it just looks like to someone else who doesn't know anything, looking from the outside, going, "What are you doing?" So I get your
yeah.
point. I think your point is beautiful. It's spot on. Do you reckon we could read one more? Okay. What was the second one?
Did you want me to do? Yeah, you wanted me to do the longest day.
Let's do that, and we'll end with that.
Sure.
The longest day is a long poem, isn't it?
Slightly, but I read fast.
No, don't read fast. Just read it. Let's read it. It's a beautiful one.
Okay, the longest day. In the beginning, you created the heaven and the earth, and your face brooded over the waters of the deep, and you summoned the light, the fowls, or creeping things, and me. And we came. We tunneled through the molten darkness, newborns fenced with bones, cartilage fashioned with flesh. And we waited. I waited the longest. I let you stare into my nakedness with the conviction of a self-possessed lover that feeds among the lilies. And you stared, your left hand on my breast, your right on my lips. Oh, our love was better than wine and wilder than the spices in your garden. The last time you smiled at me, with those sweet-smelling lips of myrrh, an embryonic heart died in your likeness. My vineyard ceased its crops. You wandered from prophet to prophet, spreading plagues, the law, and leprosy. You tested Job on his devotion, Elijah on his convictions, and twice protected Hagar from Sarah's jealousy. Women suffered barrenness for years before you submitted with compassion. Only one woman proved favorable. They say she bore you a son who could cure the lame, the blind, the mute, the bleeding. And a bleeding woman thought, if I may but touch his garment, I shall be whole. And she was whole, and she was clean. What garment was there for me to touch? What gall for me to swallow? Physicians today remove disease for a small fee, but the disease you left me with, no physician can incise and cure. Month after month, it's there, chewing on womb like termite on tree. I let you know this. You only say, good wombs make good babies, except good babies may not make good adults. Oh, why was I not granted Rebecca's assurance, though two nations split in her womb? Or Ruth's craft at persuading her kinsman to lie with her unwed. Even Elizabeth in her old age received the Holy Ghost. I tried so hard to conceive without you, appealed to Saint Sophia and her daughters for a child of my own. They gave me a daughter who can never be a savior. She can never be God. My other lover recently confessed, I don't believe Jesus was God either, or that he boasted, I am the way, the truth, the life. And I don't believe, he said, that our unborn child will be punished just because I ironed on a holy day. But he has not seen your wrath, your jealousy, the millions killed in the great flood. He does not know why you give a loaf to every bird, but just a crumb to me. Why I tell myself this daughter I carry may never restore me from the embarrassment of your unrequited love. Is it you who disapproves of me washing laundry on Fridays? Or is it the old wife whose prattling whiskers rise and fall with every falsehood told? Or the mother you gave me, the mother who gave her to the world? She insisted that your son was crucified every Friday, so no sock, underwear, bra, or trouser could be washed. Can't imagine either one of these women as embryos. They live while I die watching you renovate the world like an old-fashioned schoolmarm. And this daughter I carry, this lover I've married, will die too someday, just like my father. Is it you who implanted this destiny in us? Will you die with us too, you who echo, I am that I am? And who is that exactly, if not your true beloved, who bows to your absence like a thirsting dianthus, who prays to keep alive her lover and child longer than herself?
Helen, I love that poem. I think that is my favorite of everything I've read of you so far. That's not everything.
Yeah.
I haven't exhausted your collections. And I'd love to read more. And you know, I have to say, it's so beautiful. It's a beautifully written poem.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
The aesthetics of it, the wording, the phrasing, the multiple reference, the rich references to biblical narrative, the biblical text. So I'm picking all that up because like I know it, I've read it.
Yes.
And when I read,
Yes.
this is amazing.
Yes.
And so, gosh. So this is there's a lot of you in this, and you're being so generous.
Yeah. I am. I have to admit.
Vulnerable,
Oh, yeah.
right? Is
Yeah,
it putting
yeah.
yourself that's brave. I have to commend you. You are so brave. I
Yeah,
wish I could
it's
write poetry like
oh,
that.
um, well, look, the thing is, it is, I think in many ways, this is the sum total of my queries
Mm,
over the years growing up. Um, and all of those tied in with superstitions learnt in the home, which are very big in Greek culture. I don't know about in your culture, but in my culture, it's huge. You
yeah.
know,
Yes.
don't leave the your shoes upside down. Don't do
Oh,
this. Don't do that. Cut your nails at night. Don't do this. Don't do that. It's the craziness of it. Don't wash on Fridays. Now, this has killed me emotionally. I don't wash on Fridays because this is the one OCD thing
that you can't get rid of.
that I can't get rid of.
Wow.
I cannot do it. And it's from a story that my mum told me many years ago, and she keeps telling me the story because it's a figure six, and she keeps telling the story, and she means right well to make sure that I don't wash on Fridays. But it was her mother who prohibited her from washing on Fridays because of whatever reason I do not know. There's many sort of narratives within my home and within my extended family why that is. None of them really make sense. My mum's one put the fear of God in me. It's like if you wash on Fridays, your spouse will die.
Wow.
Or someone in your family will die.
Wow.
And that totally stuffed my head as a young
enough.
child.
That would be enough for me.
Yeah, it's enough for me.
Yeah.
It was enough for me.
I don't want anyone to die.
No, it's a load of hogwash. That's superstition.
But still.
But still, because my mum recalls of her pulling out, those old sort of wash basins, old village wash basins. She pulled that out one Friday to wash clothes. Her mum came out full force and got angry. She said she got so mad at me. I had no idea what I did wrong. And then realized that it was Friday and she wasn't supposed to be washing laundry on Fridays. And so even one of my newer poems comes back to that very superstition or ritual or whatever it is. And it's not, and I've been trying to make sense in heads or tails of it. And a lot of these kinds of sort of superstitions are tied in and mixed in with when you're young with religion.
Yeah.
And you can't tell the one from the other. You can't tell. And when you start to use God in the name of superstition, you won't be able to tell as a kid whether or not this is something higher than, or
yeah, you don't know which is which.
You don't know which is which.
Yeah.
So unraveling all of that is a nightmare.
Well, that's a lifetime's work.
Right. That poem took me years to write. It wasn't something that I sat down. I went through many iterations of it. And I can't even really say how it began, but I remember it began in just free verse form. And then as I started to pull in some of the Old and New Testament references, I started to form it in that parable verse form that you see in the Bible, because I found it made for a very interesting way of digesting belief.
Yeah.
Your belief, because there's a lot of that happens in the Song of Songs. God is a lover. In other forms of the Bible, though, there is question marks.
Yes.
Job questions.
Yes.
He can't help it. It's like, his whole world has come undone. And I found that an interesting sort of form to work with. And I would like to come back to that form. It's a very interesting form to draw on, especially if you're thinking about your faith and where you stand in all of this, and making that distinction between faith and things that you get taught by, family, and family using God as a kind of, you know, a way into scaring you into action or shame or guilt.
That should be outlawed.
Well, it should be outlawed, ideally. But and I don't blame my mum. I think even my mum doesn't really understand the reason behind it, because even she says, I don't know what where that really comes
there's
from.
no point in blame.
No, there isn't. There isn't any point in blame.
What you're given now and what you're sitting with, I think is if I may say, has some grace in it. So I think you're working through it is a part of your destiny. It's a part of your come to terms with who you are. Who is Helen?
Who is Helen? Nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? I love that Dickinson poem, because it's more and more do I think of, you know, that whole idea of being nobody, nothing, nothingness.
Yes.
Not nobody's in nothing and nothing at all.
That's right.
You're irrelevant.
Yeah.
But nobody's in, like, you know, you're here today, gone tomorrow. And you're passing things on, you know, your cells kind of form into something else, you know, you're part of the dirt, you're part of whatever it is. You could be a tree or a worm or whatever that
exactly
works its way back up and it turns into a flower, I don't know, something. But I'm really interested in that whole sort of that holistic view of the self, rather than the one that's here right now, right this second. It's and you know, damaged or traumatized or whatever. There's more than that. It's I think there is something that you can work with, whether it's trauma or it's something really beautiful and great and joyful in your past. And the written word is wonderful for that. The correspondence and discussion is great for that. But I think essentially just those bigger questions, for me at least, will always be questions. We started off this whole last discussion with, you know, you pointing out, you know, the presence of God. You know, that absence is the presence, and vice versa. And we are none the wiser beyond that point. The unknowing. The unknowingness in insecurity to lie, Dickinson says, is joy's ensuing quality. Don't get too close to things. He starts that poem off saying, go not too near a house of rose, the depredation of a breeze. She kind of lists, in the end, comes to that point of in insecurity to lies, joy's ensuing quality. And that's my favorite poem. It's a short poem. It's one of her later poems, because I feel she gets it then. Yeah. It's like the closer you come to something, the closer you try to explain something, the more further away you are. And I think she gets that with the crumb and the realization. I think she realizes those crumb poems, those thirst and starvation and fasting poems are the realization, the further away you are, fasting is a further away from, means that you are then closer to. So yeah, I feel the same thing. And again, I don't know whether she's rubbed off on me or vice versa. I've come in because I feel the same way. I sense things the same way. It's like the further away you are, the more you try to explain things, you know. Definitely, I can see the Dickinson element in your poem. Especially in this collection, there was definitely a lot there. And I love it. I really do. I really genuinely, I look forward to reading more of you. So I'm going to have to purchase some of your collections. Seriously, I love poetry, but and I'll say most of the time I spent with poetry is Sufi Persian poetry because of my work. But I love poetry, and I don't read enough English. I think I should read more. But yeah, I really enjoy it. Yeah, poetry is poetry. Yeah, no, true. It's beautiful no matter what you go to. And I've got Ruby at home sitting there on my desk, my little chair of a pile of books that I'm dying to read. Well, yeah, I've got a pile. Isn't that yeah. Working through I'm not the only one. I really enjoyed taking time out and reading your Thank you poetry. for asking me to read. Thank you for having this discussion about Dickinson. For sure. It's always wonderful to and if there is a Dickinson out there in some sort of ethereal presence, thank you for Dickinson's
Yeah.
poetry.
Absolutely.
Thank you for writing them.
Indeed, let's acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And so, again, I hope thank you for making the time to come in and have a chat with me. And also, I would really love to speak to you again once you
Yeah.
do more
Yeah.
poetry and more
Yes.
more Dickinson work.
Persuade
part
me
two.
to do more. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you.